Following is a conversation with Erin Kenny, the CEO of Nutrition Rewired. Erin is a registered dietitian with a master's in nutritional science. She's done an amazing job in building a business up that helps people take control of their lives through modulating their diet, improving their gut health, and ultimately looking after the gut microbiome. Today's conversation was far-reaching. We talked about fibre, we talked about gums, we talked about artificial sweeteners, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, supplements. This was pretty much a to Z of what to do to look after your gut health, what works and what doesn't. Really appreciated how simply Erin put lots of complicated topics for the listener. She also has her own podcast, so that might explain why she was such a good guest. This is an amazing episode for anyone who's wanting to enter into this field, but we also digged into some technical aspects and I learned a lot over the course of the conversation. This is Inside Matters. My name is Dr. James McIlroy. I hope you enjoy it. So how did you get interested then in gut health?
It was a very selfish journey for me. I, from a very young age, struggled with digestive issues. They had to take me off of being breastfed when I was a baby and got onto formula fed and, I was struggling with a ton of digestive issues. And basically they just slapped me with a diagnosis of lactose intolerance. And basically went most of my childhood struggling with horrible pain, horrible bowel movements. I will honestly say that a majority of my childhood was spent in the bathroom because of how bad things were with my gut. And I really didn't have much help. It was kind of just, let's watch out for dairy and let's watch out for triggers and things like that. But it was kind of just, take elodium and hope for the best. So fast forward, as I started to get older, I was a full-time athlete. I was, in high school and really wanted to start taking care of myself. I struggled with mental health issues. I lost my father to his battle with mental health struggles. And it started to connect with me that on the days when my stomach was at its worst, my mental health was also at its worst. And so I was starting to make these connections and, learn, and spent a lot of time on Google, which, we all know is not a reputable source of information. But nonetheless, I was interested in seeking alternative ways to help support my body. And when I went to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to major in. And I thought, nutrition sounds like something that I could use some support with, considering everything that I'm going through and, the things that I've read online. And from there on out, it was just about healing myself. I learned, after being on a decade of medications, from birth control to fix the hormone imbalance, from PPIs to address the chronic acid reflux, I was just being thrown medication after medication because doctors were just treating symptoms. So I dedicated all my time to researching about, the gut microbiome and nutrition. And then I was in school for nutrition. And I started following people in the field who were talking about these things, talking about the gut microbiome, talking about how nutrition impacts mental health. And I just lit up. It was like for the first time in my life, someone was speaking to me, and I felt validated too. For so many years, it's like, it's just all in your head. You just gotta, stop eating dairy. And I've now basically built a business on helping individuals get to the root cause of their digestive issues and imbalances because of everything that I went through. So I'm incredibly passionate about what I do. And I'm just really excited to chat with you today.
So what were some of the key things then as you went along your own journey that made the biggest impact to your own health?
I will highlight a very important one that I think a lot of people don't consider, and that's stress. There was a lot of stress in my life, and I was kind of putting that on the back burner as something that, I'm stressed, I'm, working out intensely and doing all this stuff, but that can't that's not going to make a huge difference. So I really had to prioritize stress as one of them. Diet, as we all know, is incredibly important. My diet was not supportive of what I needed for my body. I played around with the plant-based diet, and I have no shame for anybody who loves their plant-based diet, but for me, it was not the right fit. I needed a plant-forward diet, but I also needed more protein. I needed to really hone in on focusing on diversity of what I was eating. I was eating a lot of the same things over and over again. I think a lot of us can get into a rut pretty easily with that. And then I learned, how much diversity our gut needs in terms of the microbiome. So stress, diet was huge. And then I had to address imbalances. I had small intestinal bacterial overgrowth because I was on proton pump inhibitors long term. I had yeast overgrowth. So a lot of these things I learned from stool testing, and then I was able to address them holistically.
Going back to the stress then, so how do people identify if their stress levels are too high? And you mentioned exercise. Maybe exercise is a double-edged sword. If you do too much, it might be actually a big stress on your body. So what are your tools and tips then for stress management? Because I guess a little bit is good for you, right? But too much is detrimental.
Sure. Yeah, we call that eustress, right? It's that period where you're kind of in that Goldilocks sweet spot where stress is beneficial. It helps us grow. It's good for inflammation. But in terms of my own journey, I would love to say that I had this lovely revelation of your stress and you need to pull back. It was one of those moments. I say this to clients all the time. It's if you listen to your body when it whispers, you don't have to hear it when it screams. And I was at the screaming point where I was running 7 to 10 miles a day. And, I got to a point where I couldn't barely even walk because I was just so obsessed with how exercise made me feel, how good it was for my mental health. So I was basically forced in to loving yoga. It wasn't love at first. It was it was not love at first. It was a rocky relationship to begin with, but I thought this is the only thing I can do. Yoga is the only thing that I physically can do that's going to support my mental health. And I just fell in love with it. So yoga, and to this day, has always been an incredible stress management technique for me because not only do I get to move my body, but I'm doing it in a way that's not inflammatory. I'm doing it in a way where I'm feeling everything of what's going on in my muscles and how tight I am, and breath, right? I'm breathing. So a lot of times people will say, I'm just not good at meditation. And I'll say, well, have you tried yoga? Have you tried walking or yoga? Those are also forms of meditation because you have to focus on your breath. If you're in a down dog position and you're sweating and you're tired, the only way you're going to get through that pose is that you're going to breathe. So meditation and yoga have been incredible assets to my healing journey, but also just the way that I manage my stress now, and also just the awareness of what is my threshold for stress and what are some of the signs that come up for me when I know I've hit my breaking point. I become more irritable towards the people that I love. My sleep starts to suffer. My digestion starts to go off a little bit. So these are kind of my red flags of, hey, Erin, let's check in with yourself. You might be doing a little too much.
So are those the sort of whispers then before the screams? The irritability, the sleep? Yeah.
And for females too, even males. I guess
most people think.
Yeah, changes in hormones, you notice changes in your menstrual cycle or your libido, those types of things can also take a hit when you're dealing with chronic stress.
Because I guess a lot of people think, oh, well, I'm a little bit tired today, I'll just drink more coffee. Or I'm a little bit sore today, I'm just going to train more. But what you're saying is maybe you need to just slow down to perform better.
Exactly. And I also love to talk to clients about how caffeine actually works. Caffeine doesn't give us energy. It actually blocks these adenosine receptors in our brain. And these adenosine receptors are like those little whispers of us hearing the signal that we're tired. And once that caffeine wears off, those adenosine receptors don't go away. They're still there to then tell our brain, hey, we're really tired. So I always tell people that you're not giving yourself more energy by loading up on caffeine. You're decreasing your perception of how tired you are, which is allowing you to push through something, whether it's a workout or a long, night at work. And over time, especially, your body is going to shut down.
So as an avid coffee drinker, I'm sort of running through my head, am I drinking? Am I listening to the whispers? But have you got recommendations then for your clients around coffee and caffeine, like some rules or suggestions in terms of when to drink, how much to drink? Because that could be really interesting for the listeners on Inside Matters.
My number one tip is that, and I say this to clients, you have to eat a full breakfast before you have your cup of coffee. And when we do this experiment, sometimes my clients will say, after I had...
I'm guilty.
They'll say, oops, I didn't even want my cup of coffee after I had my breakfast. And it's because we're not using artificial fuel, right? We're eating some nice eggs with, some sweet potatoes and avocado, and, we're energized. And now we don't have this craving for a stimulant. And I'm not shaming caffeine completely, especially coffee. There's numerous health benefits in addition to the microbiome, right. But it's evaluating that relationship with it. And so I always say no coffee until you've had a full breakfast. Coffee does not count as breakfast. I tell them no caffeine after noon. The researcher, Matthew Walker, he talks about the metabolism of caffeine and, the half-life and how long that caffeine can stay in your system. And you could be laying in bed at night if you had your cup of coffee at 3 p.m. and you're still metabolizing it in the middle of the night, impacting your quality of sleep. And then the cycle just starts again, right? You wake up, you're exhausted, you're groggy. And that's because, the later in the day that can impact your sleep.
So if someone, maybe like me, who wakes up in the morning and finds a way over to the coffee, I know myself, it's like part of the routine, and I kind of love it, to be honest. But so someone's addicted to that morning routine and they come to you and they become a client. How do you get them to break that cycle and get into the routine of, I don't know, maybe cold shower, and then they come in, they've had their breakfast, then they have their coffee? Is it a slow process, or do you just say, right, that's it, cold turkey?
I'm never militant with my clients ever, because I'm also human, and I also understand that, when we make changes, that they don't need to happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't usually feel good to our nervous system or mental health wise when someone says, just cut it out. And now, don't get me wrong, I've got clients that are all or nothing, and they just, when I tell them generally what I've just told you, they'll say, forget it, I'm cutting it out. I want to do this. I want to do it perfectly. Wow. That's a type of person, right? So when we start, I get to know what their relationship is like. I had a client one time, and she had this, whole setup in her house. The whole side of the wall was dedicated to coffee. So for the client like that, we're going to say, okay, let's maybe switch to a decaf, or switch to, less of a serving and put more, almond milk in it to just cut down on the portion. And then we work our way towards maybe after breakfast. But there's lots of alternative things that you can do to still have that routine. So I'll just give my example. I drink a bone broth hot chocolate in the morning, and that bone broth hot chocolate, it doesn't, contain loads of caffeine. It's still got the gut health benefits. It's still bitter because of the cacao. And so I drink that. It's got 20 grams of protein, and it's warm, and it still gives me that. So people can find, there's all these medicinal mushroom type of blends and things like that. So if you can find something that you like that isn't that, burst of caffeine and acidity to your stomach on an empty stomach, then that might help the transition be a little bit easier.
Thank you so much for that example. Mark, who's one of the hosts here at the podcast studio, has bone broth and cayenne pepper.
Okay, there you go.
In the morning. Yep. And bizarrely, I was speaking to him on Tuesday because we were planning for the week, and we were talking about you. And I said, because he was drinking in the same type of Yeti coffee mug as me, and I was like, "Oh, nice mug! Like you're one of the good guys." Is that coffee? And he explained that no, this is bone broth, and it's part of his routine to get great nutrition in the morning, and it's still warm, and as you say, it sort of feels like a coffee, but it's not really a coffee. So, I'm going to go for it.
All
I'm
right.
going to start my day with some bone broth.
I expect a report back. I'd love to hear from you.
I'll give you a report. I can't promise to stop the coffee.
That's not the
I
goal.
might go from 2 shots to 1 shot.
Okay.
I think 2 shots to 1 shot.
That's success.
But you mentioned the health benefits of coffee. It's really interesting. I've had several people come on. So one of them was Professor Debbie Shawcross, who's like a leading authority on liver health.
Mm-hmm. Basically
saying, drink more coffee because for some reason it's protective against cirrhosis and non-alcoholic fatty changes. So there's something in there, isn't there?
I think there's so many aspects of it. I think, you and I are big into gut health, right? So we're probably going to always look at it from a gut health lens. And, my scientific brain goes to, well, coffee helps people have a bowel movement, right? It stimulates the liver and digestion. And if we're having regular bowel movements and stimulating that process, that's great for the liver, right? We don't want, sluggish digestion. So just one of the many, there's antioxidants in there. There's the polyphenols that feed beneficial bacteria. And, the liver and the gut are most certainly connected.
So could you maybe walk the listeners through some of the other things you try and help your clients with? So that you mentioned stress, diet. Maybe we can unpack diet a little bit more because that must be huge in terms of, taking control of your health and your microbiome and your gut.
Sure. Yeah. As a dietitian, people expect that we just focus on food, and we often do. There's not usually one client who comes in that there's not something diet related that we're talking about. And everyone's starting at different ends of the spectrum, right? Some people have no knowledge that, they're not even getting nearly enough protein. They're not eating any vegetables, that the kind of standard American diet where a lot of processed foods, a lot of refined grains that aren't providing any fiber or nutrition. So there's so many different ends of the spectrum of things that we work on. And then you have, clients who have overgrowth or SIBO, like SIBO, for example, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and they're eating super clean, air quote clean, where they're not touching a processed food. They're loading up on fiber because they've been told fiber, fiber, fiber. If you want better gut health, eat more fiber. And that's making them feel worse. So there's that end of the spectrum where we have to obviously address the underlying root cause, but we need to simplify their diet, make it easy for them to break things down a little bit, give their gut some rest. And then there's the other spectrum where, I have a woman come to me and she's eating 1 egg for breakfast. And I'm saying, where's your protein? She said, well, I haven't had an egg for breakfast. I said, well, 1 egg is 6 grams of protein. We need 25 to 30 grams of protein to start our day, right? Yep. So there's all these missing links.
So we've talked about breakfast quite a lot then, because as you know, within the sort of wellness, health sphere, there's this debate around intermittent fasting. And it sounds like you're very much in favor of you should have a really great nutritious breakfast with your micronutrients and the macronutrients to set you up for the day. Is that the case? So you're big on breakfast for you and your clients?
So for me, yes. I've always tried to adopt that my philosophy on my own nutrition and what I think makes me feel best is not going to determine what I think is best for a client. Sure. And I think that's really important. I think a lot of, health professionals, it's, they find something that works for them or works for some of their clients, and then everyone should do it. Now, would I recommend intermittent fasting to people? No, it wouldn't be my first recommendation for the majority of people that I work with. I have worked with clients, and most of those clients end up being males who do really well with intermittent fasting. Maybe it's males, or oftentimes it's women who are post-menopause and they have specific goals, maybe related to body composition and hormone balance. And they've found that these practices of intermittent fasting in whatever fashion make them feel really good. A lot of these are CEOs of companies that they love the focus aspect of it during the day. And, so I'm just going to come in and I'm going to work with them and say, well, if this works for you and you're not binge eating at night and feeling like you're deprived during the day and you're getting good nutrition in your feeding window, then I'll work with you. We'll work with where you're at. But the majority of my clients, especially those that are female and they're still cycling, this can really disrupt their hormones. It can disrupt their ability to work out during the day. And so we have to really personalize that if it's going to be part of the protocol. And the research that I've seen, my biggest concern is the body composition. I've seen the loss of muscle mass be a potential. And I think that's a huge issue for a lot of people, right? We all need nice, lean muscle mass. And if fasting, if we continue to see research that fasting negatively impacts our lean muscle tissue, I don't love that.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it makes sense, right? You stop consuming calories, you've got no protein intake, therefore there's no amino acids moving around. So it kind of makes sense that your body's going to look for energy within itself.
Yeah.
And I guess muscle is a target. It's probably less desirable than fat and certainly your glycogen stores.
For sure.
But it kind of makes sense that it forms part of that, source of energy that we need.
Our bodies are incredible.
And just on the muscle mass thing. Oh yeah, absolutely. And on the muscle mass thing then, I guess maybe some women listeners might think that doesn't really apply to me. That's for men that lift and train and work out. But that's not the case, is it? It's just as important, maybe even more important.
I'm not a buff woman. Okay. I get, up to 130 grams of protein per day. And I'm not, what people, a lot of women would think I would turn into by eating as much protein as I do. But I will tell you some things about me is that I'm very strong. I'm very strong in the gym. I have a good lean body mass. My hormones are balanced. I don't have cravings for sugar throughout the day. Those are the things that protein does for us. And so I think we need to understand that from a biochemical aspect, protein is essential. It is protective. It increases our metabolism. It's the only macronutrient that has a higher thermic effect of food. That's incredible. So we, just old school recommendations that always seem to sneak their way into further generations.
So how does someone know, I mean, if they're not got the benefit of working with an expert dietitian like you, how do they know if they're on the right track for protein? And in addition to the actual macronutrient gram per day recommendations, how important is the source of protein for people?
That's a great question. So we have two different types of protein. We have a complete protein, which is basically a protein that combines all of the essential amino acids, which amino acids are the little building blocks of what protein is. And essential, meaning our body needs them to survive and to produce the daily functions and live optimally. So that's an essential amino acid. That's a complete protein. Those food sources are things like meat, fish, eggs. These are animal proteins. And then you have the incomplete side where we have incomplete proteins. And these are going to be plant-based foods. There are a few plant-based foods that are complete proteins, but the majority, things like beans and lentils, these are not complete proteins. So they're just missing a few of those amino acids that we need for essential daily living. Now, this doesn't mean that non-complete proteins are not beneficial, but the requirement of how much you would need per day slightly goes up because the digestibility, how able we are to digest these proteins, is not as efficient, if you were to eat eggs or a piece of fish, for example. So my approach is try to get some really good quality complete proteins in your diet and then also get some incomplete protein sources in your diet, like lentils and beans and nuts and seeds, if that's something that works with, your individualized physiology. But this idea that everything has to be a complete protein, I think is also, too far left because, bone broth isn't a complete protein, but it's still an excellent source of protein. And I'm still going to have, salmon for dinner and I'm going to hit my total,
Right.
amino acid needs for the day, if you will.
And the total amino acid needs for the day, how does one calculate what they may or may not need?
That's a great question. So the amino acids themselves, you could use something like, I think a chronometer might do this on a very, specific level. I don't know if it goes that into detail, but we look at the total grams of protein as a dietitian, so
Right.
we're looking for usually around 1.2 up to 2 grams per kilogram per day of protein for each person. So the minimum, like the USDA requirements for protein, we're talking 0.8 grams per kilogram per day for a person, however you need to convert that. But 0.8 is not a recommendation I use for any of my clients. We're always going above that, especially when my clients are more active or they're looking to optimize their body composition. Yep. We're looking closer to like up to 1 to 2 grams per kilogram. So that's your goal, is to really figure out like what is that number for you based on your body weight, and then how can you spread that throughout the day. You don't have to completely spread it evenly, but I usually just tell people to make it easier, get 25 to 30 grams at each meal, and then adjust, add to that to meet your needs, and then add snacks where appropriate. But that's a good baseline if they're kind of starting from ground zero.
That's an amazing summary of protein. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
How do supplements fit into that? And I'm asking you in the context of this minimally processed versus like ultra processed food debate we have all the time. So some people say, oh yeah, whey protein supplement contains the essential amino acids, go for it. But other people say, whoa, it's so processed, you shouldn't have it. So what are your thoughts then on supplements and how they fit in?
I think supplements can be great. I think they have a time and a place. And, a lot of the times convenience is a big reason. For somebody that has a protein goal of 180 grams per day, meeting that might be really challenging if they're not throwing in some whey protein into a smoothie or a shake. Whey protein is excellent. Yes, it's processed, but so is your oatmeal and your brown rice and your ground meat. Like everything is processed. And if you choose grass-fed, protein powder, a whey protein powder with minimal ingredients that maybe just has whey, maybe some, sweetener and something to just add some salt or whatnot. But if you have like a 3-ingredient protein powder, it's high quality grass-fed, and you add that to your smoothie, you're doing wonderful things for your body. So I think it really comes into when you see these, those, bodybuilding companies always start these protein powders, and it's, strawberry cheesecake or cookie dough. Yeah. And I used to eat these. I'm not saying I've never tried them.
They do taste good.
They do. They taste just like they say they do, or at least when you're, eating healthy, they do. And, that's when we get into the long list of ingredients. We see, binders and gums and artificial sweeteners, and we see, things that can really not make us feel good, especially from a gut health perspective. So a good quality, one that's been maybe tested for heavy metals, things like lead, that can be common in plant-based protein powders, arsenic. If we get a good quality protein powder, minimal ingredients, high quality testing, ask for the certificate of analysis from the company, then you're going to help yourself out if you're struggling to get your protein intake.
Thank you for that. I've got so many things written down to ask you now. I'm actually not even sure where to start. I've got fibers, gums, sweeteners, heavy metals, other macronutrients. Before I jump into sort of more supplements and the sweeteners and the heavy metals, I'd kind of like to round off the diet piece with you more generally. So maybe talk a little bit about fiber, fruit and veg, talk about carbs and fats. So,
yes.
When you're working with all your clients and for yourself as well, how do you build like an optimal diet? Big question.
Yes. No, it's a great one.
How do you create like an optimal regime?
Absolutely. So we start with, again, base. Like we kind of find this base for people to start. And that's where the 3 meals per day comes in. If someone's not used to eating breakfast, we're going to try to get them to start eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or we can call it meal 1, meal 2, meal 3, whatever your schedule is like. And at that meal, we're aiming to get, again, that 25 to 30 grams of protein. We want to hit half a plate of vegetables that are colorful. Usually like darker leafy greens tend to be an area that a lot of people struggle. So we try to look for those dark pigments. And then the other portion of that, usually I say like a fist of carbohydrates minimum at your meal. And we try to choose carbohydrates. Every meal. Yep. And we try to choose carbohydrates that are more complex. So things like higher fiber carbs. So if you're looking at a label, you're going to see fiber there. But if you're just in the produce section and you're looking at carbohydrate sources, potatoes have fiber, both sweet and white potatoes. Things like quinoa, plantains, bananas. These are all sources of carbohydrates that are very nutrient dense. If a client's more active, those carbohydrate intakes might go up. We might be consuming more carbohydrates per day. And then fat is incorporated into those meals. We try to focus on healthy fats, particularly omega-3 fats. So things like wild-caught salmon. We're looking at things like mackerel, sardines, herring. These are omega-3 rich fats that we have to get 2 to 3 servings per week. So we've got 3 meals per day: protein, vegetable, carbohydrate, healthy fats included. And then we kind of go from there. We say, okay, are you working out? Okay, well, we need a pre-workout, post-workout routine. And how can we adjust there? You're training for a marathon. Okay, your carbohydrate needs go up significantly. We're going to have to adjust that. But once we have that base, and you don't have to focus so much on the grams of fiber, although we are aiming for about 25 to 35 grams per day. If you're choosing complex carbs, if you're choosing half your plate of vegetables, then you're likely going to hit your fiber needs for the most part.
It's going to happen, right? It's going to happen. Just by default, because it's quite difficult to find the fiber on the foods and to figure out. Yeah.
Yes. And if you're focusing
Sorry, there's a bit of a lag. You please continue, please. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, so if you're focusing on getting the majority of your foods from less processed foods, then you're, again, likely to hit those fiber goals because you're going to be choosing those types of fruits and vegetables and things like that just naturally come with, the benefit of the fiber.
Absolutely. I'm going to just push you a little bit on ketogenic diets, and people even go more extreme and they have these carnivore diets. And you've been quite clear in your recommendation around you should have some carbohydrate with each meal. So could we just unpack that a little bit and what some of the, why is that part of your recommendation versus, just eat meat and veg, for example?
Mm-hmm. So the main focus there is blood sugar balance. And this is something that people think this is a discussion just reserved for people who have, say, diabetes. They got to watch their blood sugar and, we've got to make sure they don't eat too many carbohydrates. But the reality is we all should care about blood sugar. Blood sugar impacts our cardiovascular system. It impacts our mental health. It impacts our hormones. It impacts our muscle growth and maintenance. So having stable blood sugar throughout the day is absolutely key to optimal performance, energy, all those things that we're talking about. And so being able to get a steady, adequate amount consistent throughout the day is going to allow that blood sugar to just kind of have this nice little up and down throughout the day. And we're going to stay within this nice range that the body likes to stay in for optimal health. When you go get your blood work done and you get your hemoglobin A1C tested, that's your report card of how well you've been managing that blood sugar over the past 3 months, how well you've been staying within that range. And when you don't eat carbs for breakfast and you don't eat carbs for lunch, and then you have a carb dinner, you're more likely to see a larger spike in those blood glucose levels. Again, this isn't the case for everybody. If somebody has been on a low carb diet and they've maintained that and their blood sugar is great and they're feeling awesome, I'm so happy for them and I would support them in that way. But for the majority of us, we have these habits where our carbs are not distributed properly. We're not eating the right amounts. We're either eating too much in one sitting, not enough at one sitting, and we're wondering why we're craving sugar all the time and why we're tired all the time. And if we just got high quality carbohydrates at every meal in adequate amounts, not overdoing it, not underdoing it, we might find a really healthy balance. And not to mention, the trouble with those low carb diets is the number one symptom is constipation, because these carbohydrates feed our beneficial bacteria. I probably see 10 to 15 stool tests per week. And anytime I see someone come in with a carnivore, keto, low carb diet, they have very low beneficial bacteria. And it is pretty much causation, right? We can pretty much assume that the correlation there is because they're not feeding those beneficial bacteria. Yeah. So my theory, 100%. The keto diet, it's originally designed for medical purposes, and it's incredible for, patients who are diagnosed with a type of epilepsy, and it has changed their lives, reduced the amount of seizures that they have. I don't think that the majority of the United States needs to be on a carnivore or ketogenic diet, especially long-term. We don't really know the long-term effects of eating, a ketogenic carnivore diet. And, I suspect that a lot of people that have found that they feel so good on those diets could be because they have an underlying gut imbalance. And now they're not feeding it with any fiber, any carbs, and that's kind of maintained their symptoms. So they feel really good. And that's just a theory. It's just my thought, that a lot of people find those diets because they're looking for relief and to feel good. And ultimately we all want to feel good, right? But if we're not addressing a root cause, then that's a problem, especially if it forces you to be on that restrictive of a diet.
I mean, the way I like to describe the carnivore diets to some people is you're essentially starving your microbiome. It's not getting anything that it needs, really. I mean, there's some microbes that can metabolize amino acids, and maybe some more complex chains and proteins, but it's, as you mentioned, it's really the fibers, it's the complex carbohydrates that they really truly need.
Yeah, there's a few specific bacteria the Faecalibacterium presbytei, the Akkermansia, these are two keystone, I'm sure you're familiar with them, they're two keystone bacteria in our gut. And one of the things that they thrive on is polyphenol-rich foods. Polyphenol-rich foods are going to be things like our berries, our, pomegranate and grapes, and those dark pigmented fruits, and leafy green vegetables, which wouldn't essentially be allowed on some of those diets. And those are keystone species for protecting our gut lining, for 100%. Protecting us against things like inflammatory bowel disease. So I don't know how you could convince me that a diet void of all these amazing foods, and mentally for myself, I could never, that's just, no, it's not for me.
I've got a note to ask you about your diet and your routine in its totality, but just like to explore this fiber concept a little bit more. So one of the things that you said at the start, which I think was absolutely fascinating, and you just touched on it again with people getting relief. I think maybe you're talking about the SIBO and how things are just going a bit crazy, and counterintuitively, whilst perhaps in someone who doesn't have SIBO and who's functioning correctly otherwise, fiber is brilliant. For them who've got too many bugs in the upper GI tract, maybe fiber's not so good. So maybe you can walk the listener through that, and also how you help these people get them to a state where maybe they can tolerate fiber again.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this would go for, certain conditions, patients who have inflammatory bowel disease as well. If they're dealing with a lot of chronic inflammation, again, fiber is hard to break down. And that's part of what makes it good for healthy individuals, is that it's hard to break down. We don't digest a good majority of it, therefore it feeds our beneficial bacteria. But for those who are struggling, those who really find that, they start to eat a salad and it completely destroys them, or, the thought of any sort of vegetable on their plate is a nightmare. then we're basically going to go forward and do some sort of testing. So the gold standard for the SIBO is going to be a breath test. We're going to be testing for 3 types of gases: methane, hydrogen, and hydrogen sulfide. And then we're also probably going to do a GI map to look at overgrowths in the colon, the lower part of the digestive tract as well. And if that person has a lot of overgrowth, then typically the course of action is going to be some sort of antimicrobial. And that could be either you could go to your conventional medicine doctor and you could choose to go that route, or you could choose to take the more natural route and use things like berberine, allicin, grapefruit seed extract, neem. These are all natural antimicrobials that have been shown to be very effective at killing off harmful bacteria, both in the small intestine and the large intestine. And it's not just as simple as killing them off, right? We want to figure out what else is going on. Are they super stressed all the time? Do they have low stomach acid? Are they on a proton pump inhibitor, which is, again, further reducing their stomach acid? We also want to look at the whole picture so that this doesn't happen again. Because the number one thing with SIBO is that people have reoccurrence because they just go in, they say, let's kill this off, but they don't address the fact that they have motility issues, thyroid issues, stress that is just like unbearable. And then they wonder why it comes back. So that's the big thing with addressing the gut, is that we don't hone in on one specific thing. It's not as simple as like, oh, vitamin D is low, we increase it, or it's right. Okay, so how did we get here? This your gut is like a forest, right? You go into a forest and you just pull one thing out, you still have the whole forest there.
So how do you then, in your practice, help your patients with SIBO? Do you recommend the berberine, the grapefruit extract, that kind of thing? And have you had good success with people?
Yes. So those are the herbs that I like to use. Those are a few of the evidence-based herbs that have been very effective with my patients. And I've seen a lot of my clients get better with just a few rounds of these. Some, they do 1 round and we've addressed everything else and they're totally better. Some of my clients have had to go through 2 or 3 rounds of it to really fully get rid of it. But we'll retest and we'll continually see those levels go down and down and down. And it's amazing to see people feel better. You start to see their iron labs start to go up because they start absorbing their nutrients, their vitamin D levels start to go up. It's a fascinating, progression of how people can be impacted by SIBO. And for so long, the statistics show that about 70 people who are diagnosed with IBS actually have SIBO. And they'll go their whole lives not knowing that because they're just going to say, well, I've got IBS, got to, be careful, follow a low FODMAP diet. And they don't ever think to look further. And most doctors, some of them don't even, we were talking about belief systems. Some of them don't believe that SIBO is a thing when it's clinically documented.
Still to this day, for sure. It's still not widely accepted amongst the medical community, and some of the things you're talking about in terms of using these natural means rather than the classical antimicrobials, also we're just not there yet, I don't think. What's your experience?
And there's a lot of great doctors out there, especially gastroenterologists, and I can't give you a long list of them, of great doctors that I know, but I can give you, some experiences from clients who their doctors are really open to, they have a good understanding. They see this in their practice every day. A lot of the doctors that say they don't believe in it, they're a little outdated, right? They haven't been keeping up on the research. They have not been seeing patients and truly hearing them for what their symptoms are. And I think that there actually is a large amount of physicians out there who are truly taking it seriously and treating. And there's a lot of doctors who are very quick to treat for SIBO with antibiotics, and they do recognize how important it is. But, it's just unfortunate that there are some out there that are leaving patients, feeling very defeated.
And with regards to the herbs that you recommend, is there like this is the entrepreneur in me now, just my mind's going, is there like, one supplement that has all the key elements in terms of all the herbs that have been beneficial? Or do you ask your patients, well, just maybe try a bit of the grapefruit extract, maybe try a bit of the berberine and see what happens?
Yes, that's a great question. There are formulations of herbs out there that are designed, or supplements out there that are designed specifically for SIBO. So they'll usually have a combination of, some of those more broad spectrum antimicrobials. I typically use them in a more isolated fashion because I love using tinctures. I like to try to reduce the amount of pills that a client will take. So oftentimes, it will be like 3 times a day, you're doing your drops of oregano, your drops of neem, and then we'll do a berberine in a pill form. And, we do that for a course of 4 to 6 weeks, and then we reassess symptoms. But there are formulations out there. There's ones that are even more broad spectrum that, are going to have additional things like wormwood in them and, things that can address yeast and candida, knowing that those things can sometimes coexist. But the benefit of my practice is that I'm able to test with clients and I'm able to see like, okay, how can we really hone in on this? And instead of doing this broad, formulation, we do something much more specific to what you need.
Yeah, my brain was just ding, 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 ding. And also I was wondering, that's just how it works in my brain. The tests that you do, I'm also fascinated. So I'm very familiar with the hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen methane, because Enterobiotics is actually going to be doing a clinical trial in the IBS area. So I've been reading all about IBS-C and methane and IBS-D, post-infectious, SIBO, and so on. But I wondered, because what you're talking about is fascinating. It's a combination of the breath test, it's a combination of the stool test. So do you have providers that you go to and that you trust to give you the right kind of data? Or do patients come to you having done a microbiome test like at home?
Yes. So the majority of what I will have clients do with their providers is have their standard colonoscopy, endoscopy, get their blood work done. If they can get, the things that I like to see, like the ferritin, iron, B12, vitamin D. So I'll usually have them do that just because it's covered by insurance, right? We try to save clients as much money as possible, knowing that these types of cases can be, more intensive and costly. And so the stuff that we will do together, luckily as a dietitian, we have different resources where I have an ordering physician on my team who can order the labs for me. And I've been trained to evaluate and interpret these labs over the past 10 years. And so I get these results, we sit down, we go over them together, and, we either work with their physician or just on our own, depending on how willing their other providers are. We try to work as a team to help this client get better in whatever way that looks like for them.
I've got it. Thank you. I just wondered if there was like a best-in-class microbiome testing service that you just thought was unbelievably good, that gave you so many insights. Yeah.
Yes, much more simple. I will answer that more simply here. So I love the GI map. I've been using the GI map by Diagnostic Solutions for several years. I also love Genova. That's another really great one. Sometimes that might be a better fit for a client based on kind of their symptomatology. But those are really the two main ones. And then, the breath test, I use the Trio Smart because they do all three of the breath gases versus, if you go get it done in your conventional doctor, they're likely just going to test for the hydrogen and the methane, and they might miss the hydrogen sulfide. No affiliations with the brands at all, too.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You got quite excited when you talked about vitamin D, iron, and ferritin. Can you just maybe unpack that a little bit? Why is that so important?
These are basic, labs that should be run for all of us. And I laugh about it because it's so frustrating how it's like pulling teeth with providers that you want to know what your vitamin D levels are, especially when we're in New England over here. So we're not getting UVB rays from the sun to produce vitamin D on our skin for a very large portion of the year. And also just scientifically knowing that 90% of Americans are deficient in vitamin D. Vitamin D impacts our hormones, our mental health, our risk for inflammatory bowel disease, everything. It quite literally impacts everything. So vitamin D, I always have clients advocate for that because it's not done over here in the US as a standard blood panel. Iron is another one. Iron typically is tested, but ferritin, the storage form of iron, is not always tested. And this can tell us a lot about inflammation in the body. This can tell us a lot about our body's ability to absorb iron. So that one is another one, especially I work with a lot of athletes, especially endurance athletes, and they tend to be very low in ferritin. And so, if a provider saw, in 2017, your iron looked good, they're not going to test it again. And, hello, it's 2024. Things can change pretty quickly. So yeah. I like ferritin. I also like B12. Both B12, ferritin, vitamin D can tell us if there maybe is malabsorption going on related to SIBO. So these are things that are common deficiencies that I see in my practice. And, we should just be knowing regularly what our values are.
Got it. Are there any other blood tests that you recommend for the sort of general person? And I'm assuming you recommend vitamin D supplementation?
Mm-hmm. Yep. If you are deficient in vitamin D to a point where, you're getting into the 20s and lower, you're not going to be able to eat food and get your values back up. You're going to need to supplement unless you're living in a place where it's very sunny and it's very clear that you've been hibernating and lathering with sunscreen, and then you can change that habit. But the majority of people, in order to get their vitamin D levels back up, will need to supplement. So that's really important for people to know. And you always want to take vitamin D3 plus K2. K2 prevents us from absorbing too much calcium into our the vascular system, which can increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. So vitamin D3 plus K2, always have that combination together, and just make sure that you're advocating for it. If you have a deficiency in vitamin D, you're going to need to supplement. There's very few food sources of vitamin D, and those really aren't likely to move the needle if you have a deficiency.
And on the subject of supplements, do you recommend anything else? Like, for example, a greens powder, which are all the rage at the moment?
Yeah, I don't recommend those supplements. There's some out there. There's ones that I've taken that I feel really good on. The athletic greens was a big, it blew up, and they sent me a sample, and I thought, this is like another greens powder. And I'll be honest, I felt really good. I'm not going to lie to people. I felt really good when I took it. And that could be due to the fact that it's basically like a multivitamin, and it's got adaptogens like ashwagandha, which I love ashwagandha. And, it was great. I was taking it for a little while, and then, Consumer Labs came out. They independently tested all of these greens powders, and they found higher levels of lead in a lot of them, which something that just naturally occurs in the soil. When these, plants are growing, they absorb these heavy metals from the soil. And lead is not good for us, as someone might imagine, that getting lead in higher doses regularly, ideally we want no lead, but we're always going to be exposed to some level of heavy metals. But when you take something and you concentrate it down, that means you're going to get a larger dose in a small serving. And so, certain brands that I mentioned, were above the limit that I would consider safe to consume on a regular basis for optimal health. And so I, stopped using that. And I really caution my clients to be using these powders, even if they are passing heavy metal testing, they're not a replacement for food. If someone's really struggling, they might offer some assistance. There are certain fruit and vegetable capsules out there that have passed heavy metal testing, don't have any fillers in them. The brand like Juice Plus, for example, over here in the US, they seem to kind of pass with flying colors. So I would say, I think of someone like my grandmother who, she maybe eats like 2 meals a day, if even that, and she doesn't touch fruits or vegetables. She might be a good candidate for someone to take these fruit and veggie capsules just to get something in her body. But for the majority of us, we don't need 17 different, powders and vitamins in one sitting. First of all, it's really tough for our body to absorb that all at once. So you've got that aspect of it, where are you really getting all of the nutrients out of it? Number 2 is the heavy metals. And number 3 is there's typically lots of additives to them, artificial sweeteners and flavors and and things like that. So I don't, I don't recommend them, but I'm sure there are times and places for those in people's lives. But the majority of us should be just focusing on high quality foods from our diet.
Erin, this has been such an educational journey for me, in addition to the listener, because I also take AG1 once or twice a day and have done for quite a long time. Also a powder called Vibe Greens. And I had no idea about the heavy metal piece. Just no idea. And to be honest with you, I actually don't know that much about heavy metals and how they can impact on health. So can we talk about that for a little bit? Like, how do we know if we're heavy, if we've got too many heavy metals? What's the health impacts of heavy metals? And then if there's too many and it's having a health impact, what do we do? Sauna?
Yep. So heavy metals, each different type of heavy metal, from lead to arsenic to cadmium, those are three very common heavy metals that we typically see in supplements, powders, even chocolate. We see high levels of lead, unfortunately. Big chocolate fan over here, so trust me, I'm not.
No.
You're like, you're taking away my coffee, not my chocolate. No, but
yeah, what is going on here?
But again,
my AG1 in coffee, now my chocolate.
So again, like, I will use AG1 if I know I'm going out and I'm going to have a really long run. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to really educate clients on, is like, I'm not taking it every day, but I'm not never using it because I like the way it makes me feel. I'm also consuming chocolate regularly, but I'm choosing brands that are at least not the highest in lead. And I'm moderating my intake, but I probably eat chocolate at least 3 to 4 times a week. Like, I'm not going to lie. It's just, you can't avoid all of these things, but, there are some that are avoidable that are just, we're getting too much, and that could be impacting certain people. So, heavy metals can impact all of our organs. A lot of them can accumulate in our body, and it's really hard to get rid of them. Some are actually impossible to get rid of. So the kidneys can be affected, the gut can be affected, the liver, right? We can have this buildup of these heavy metals. And then on top of that, if you have an unhealthy gut, then you're more likely to have these accumulate, because if you have that intestinal permeability where things can move from your gut into your blood because you have leaky gut, you're in a worse shape to be consuming these heavy metal, containing products. But generally speaking, they have widespread impact on our health, from our brain health to our organ function. And over time, this can be very serious for people. And it's hard to say, okay, look for these symptoms. It's this happens slowly. So this could be, you show up with dementia or Alzheimer's when you're, 50 years old, and you don't realize how much of something you've been consuming. But there's testing that you can do. There's hair mineral analysis testing that can look at heavy metals, which can be really helpful. Mercury is another one that will accumulate in the body, and even just reducing your high mercury fish can really help your body work more efficiently. And then, you can kind of go back to working in moderation versus eating high mercury tuna for lunch every day, for example. So this is a very big stressor for me, is like, we need to think about moderation. We don't need to fearmonger people into being afraid of consuming chocolate or, things like that. It's education, making better choices. And then if you are someone who has really poor detox, methylation issues like MTHFR mutations, poor gut health, we might need some extra support with heavy metals. So we might use certain like green algae to help just pull heavy metals out of your system. We might use things like N-acetylcysteine, which, helps upregulate glutathione levels in the body. These are things that essentially what we're doing is we're working on chelating, things like charcoal and algae, green algae vegetables. And then we're working to support the liver and all those other upregulation processes that naturally happen in the body. And then we support the gut, and we support sweating, and we make sure our bowels are moving, and, we make sure nutrient deficiencies are addressed. And that helps us just ensure that we're, well-oiled machines that can handle, the daily toxins that we're always going to get no matter what, right? We're always going to get these things, but how can we educate ourselves, make better choices, and reduce our total heavy metal load?
What are some of the signs and symptoms that someone might have if they're sort of high in heavy metals?
So kidney issues can be a big one. Having, kidney, so if you're doing blood testing or things like that, if you're, consuming a lot of brown rice, very high in arsenic, that's something that over time, especially with smaller kids, they're even more sensitive to these levels of arsenic, for example. But kidney issues, liver issues, brain, if you're noticing, like I said, early signs of Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's disease. There's even, this is not my expertise, but, a lot of dietitians who focus on the autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, a lot of discussion around how they have a harder time with detoxification and some heavy metal accumulation. And so, refer to them for more information on that. But I've learned from other dietitians about how that can be, a way that these types of things can show up. Gut issues, heavy metals can really disrupt the gut microbiome. So, there's not really like obvious symptoms for a lot of people that you would say, oh, that's got to be heavy metals. Sometimes it's, your body just kind of slowly not functioning optimally and not realizing that your total toxic burden is just too high.
Gosh, it just made me wonder. I mean, imagine how many people with autoimmune disease, for example, may actually just be too high in these heavy metals. And I think it's one of these things where the traditional classical medical community probably aren't that interested.
Yeah, unfortunately not. And, it's a very broken system overall. And, I wish I had the solution. I wish that I could say that I could see things getting better in the future. But I think when you involve finances, when you put money into the picture, the priority of healthcare, preventative care really just seems to take the wayside, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm with you. So I'm going to bring us back now to some of the things I wanted to discuss with you. Artificial sweeteners is top of the list. So as a dietitian and expert in gut health, what are your thoughts and recommendations relating to artificial sweeteners? Because I think this is one of the ones that comes up the most when you speak to people.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I've done pretty extensive research on the artificial sweetener side of things. And this, we can also call them non-nutritive sweeteners, right? Meaning that they essentially don't provide any nutritional value to our bodies. And the goal of why people are typically using them, right, is they're trying to cut back on sugar. They want something to taste good and they don't want the sugar addition. And while that is very appealing and we love that idea, that sounds, all in theory would be great for optimal health, but we do see some concerning research. We see some concerning research about the specifics on how these artificial sweeteners can impact our gut microbiome. So a lot of these are not fully digested and broken down in our gut, and they can make their way further down through the digestive tract and then feed beneficial bacteria. So if you have a pre-existing overgrowth, or, if you don't want these certain compounds feeding beneficial bacteria, then that might be, it might not be advantageous to the individual. A lot of these artificial sweeteners also can create a lot of gas and bloating, which most people come into my office trying to avoid. And at the end of the day, they're typically not in products that are, a potato or a piece of fruit. These are in products that are usually more processed, right? They're more heavily processed. Some of those foods that really just aren't the first choice for what we should be making. So do I think that if you have, a piece of gum once a day, you're going to destroy your gut health? No. But I think if you're putting artificial sweeteners in your coffee and then you're having a cookie with it at lunch and then at dinner, you're making this like keto dessert with artificial sweeteners, I don't know that that's going to be the best choice for optimal gut health, really. And so, you can, break down each individual artificial sweetener and say this poses this much risk and this poses that much risk. But in general, I just advise clients to really try to choose products without them, try to practice moderation if you're using them, and, pay attention to your symptoms and see, how you can feel if you don't have them in your diet.
And are there any groups that are maybe better than the others? So like I've heard some people say stevia, the plant-based one is maybe better than aspartame, and some of the sucralose, that kind of thing. Do you have a view on that based on the research you've done?
Sure. Yes. I think the one that I actually use the most is monk fruit. I've seen no negative side effects of monk fruit on the gut microbiome. I have seen, actually only positive benefits, especially from like an anti-diabetic standpoint, blood pressure standpoint. So I like monk fruit personally. I think that stevia can be a good choice. I think the only research that I would point to was that it could potentially lower the lactobacillus bacteria in the gut, which, is a very important type of bacteria that we have there. But stevia and monk fruit, they're quoted as being the safer choice, but you always have to look at how they're processed. Were they extracted using really harsh solvents like hexane? And, you go to the store and you see monk fruit, and then you turn around and you see monk fruit. Erythritol is the second ingredient, and erythritol is a sugar alcohol that causes a lot of bloating and indigestion, and can really just like rip people's stomach apart. That's what patients describe it. They're like, it feels like there's someone in there just ripping my stomach apart. Oof. So monk fruit can be great, but check your labels, because a lot of them can then have additional, sugar alcohols and artificial sweeteners that might really hurt your gut. So quality.
Superb advice. And while we're on the subject, because you mentioned gums, tell us a little bit more about gums.
Yeah.
And after that, I'm going to ask you more about your business and your vision and how you've created your brand.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop interrogating you and quizzing you about all these things, but I'm fascinated, and I know the listeners are going to be fascinated as well.
Absolutely.
So, what about gums?
So gums, these are going to include things like, acacia gum and guar gum, xanthan gum. I'm trying to think of other ones. Those are probably the main ones that I see in foods nowadays. And you're going to start to see these in, so many different products. They might be in your toothpaste. They might be in crackers. They could be in your ice cream. And the purpose of why companies add these to your foods is because they're binding. They help to bind things together. And now that we've moved also towards this like gluten-free, era, this area where people are choosing lower fat, lower sugar items, they're putting those in to help replace what those other ingredients used to do. So they're giving us this nice mouthfeel. They're helping thicken a product when gluten's not there, because gluten is great at thickening. So they're in a lot of different products. I even went to the grocery store last week and I was looking at sweet potato fries, thinking, there shouldn't be any gums in sweet potato fries. There were. It was, just ridiculous how many gums we're getting in our diet, from these more packaged items. Now, not all gums.
Crazy, because sweet potato fries should just be sweet potatoes.
Right, exactly. You could put a little olive oil, you could put a little salt in there, like that's fine. But to put gums in there just seems, ridiculous. And so, obviously you would just make them at home. But, every once in a while, it'd be nice to be able to go to the store and get a product without gums in it. So these products they serve as prebiotics, meaning they feed beneficial bacteria in the gut. And that can be great, actually. Like guar gum and acacia gum have been actually pretty well researched to be helpful for certain people. Partially hydrolyzed guar gum, for example, is something that I actually use as a protocol sometimes when I'm treating SIBO with patients, because that in combination with antimicrobials has actually been shown to be very beneficial for treating SIBO. So not all gums are created equal, but most of them serve as prebiotics. They do typically alter the gut in some way, whether that's positive or negative, and it also depends on the person's gut microbiome, what that's going to be like. But a lot of the side effects that can come with these gums, especially the amount that you're consuming, a lot of gas, bloating, diarrhea, and potentially even constipation. And so, it's almost impossible to isolate like what it is that's causing the issue for you. But oftentimes clients will start to notice once we have this conversation and say, oh my gosh, everything I was eating had gums in it. My creamer that I was putting in my coffee, my bread that I had for lunch, my crackers that I had. And so when we start to reduce these, we of course start reducing processed foods overall, but we also start to, just focus on the amount, which we always talk about with nutrition, right? Like the poison is in the dose, is what I say. Is like, You can probably consume a little bit of
Interesting.
something every once in a while, but when you consume it all day, every day, and you're maybe even already at higher risk for digestive issues, these gums might not be good. And then how are these gums made? So there's certain gums like xanthan gum that can be derived from wheat, soy, corn, genetically modified ingredients, which are things that people want to maybe steer away from. And so the source of them and the way that they're manufactured, kind of similar to the sweeteners, right? Like, how are they produced? Where do they come from? What processing was involved, which isn't always something we'll be able to know from the final product, is just another thing that we want to look out for.
Now, in terms of poison in the dose, devil in the dose, is there anything which is an absolute no-go? Like palm oil, a Big Mac, beer,
not in my world.
gluten. Is there anything that's
not in my world?
Nothing's an absolute no. Even palm oil?
Unless you have an allergy. No, I've never seen, like, it's what you do consistently that will determine the outcome of your health.
Right.
You having palm oil, like, once in a given week or a month or a year, whatever, as long as you are consistent in supporting your body for optimal health the majority of the time, that Big Mac shouldn't destroy you. Like, your body should be resilient enough that if you were to go eat a Big Mac, you might not feel great, like digestive wise for a day, but you shouldn't feel the effects of that or feel like that throws off your inflammation for a week. That's a sign that body is not resilient to me. And I want patients to be able to understand that being healthy is not about perfection. It's about doing the right things consistently the majority of the time. And then understanding that if you do, let's say, again, you skipped one gym workout in the course of a month, like, tell me how much of an impact that's really going to make on the outcome of your physique. Not much, right? So we have to put things into perspective of, we can't say that, there's certain things that we can't do that are better for us. Of course, we know there are certain things that are better for us to do, but those things that aren't so good for us, as long as they don't make up the majority of our diet, I don't see that as a problem.
I can just feel the passion resonating from your body, and it's clear that this aligns to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis through Nutrition Rewired. So I think this is a great opportunity to segue into what you're trying to achieve through your platform. You've built a big following on social media, which is really impressive. People obviously love your content based on the engagement. So what is your vision for how you're building your brand and where you want to go next and what your aims and objectives are?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's, this year has been a big year of, just kind of evaluation for me, just in this stage of my life. I'm just over 30 years old, and I, never really thought about where my business was going. Things took off really quickly. I wasn't necessarily ready for what was going to happen with my business. I just had a passion for what I was doing. And I just knew that, like, me and that other person on the side of that table or screen, we need to get together, and that's where the magic's going to happen. And over the years, one thing that's really come up for me is we need a team, right? We need a team of people, because this person, I can only do so much, right? I can do testing, I can do this, I can do that. There's so much that as dietitians now we have access to, but I want an acupuncturist on my team. I want a psychologist on my team. I want I'm a personal trainer, but I don't have time to do that. I want a personal trainer on my team. I would love to get to a place where I have built, maybe it's a physical facility, because I love being in person. I love being with a crowd of people. I love community. But I want to build, and there's plenty of these types of places out there. I've even worked for companies like this, but I'd love to build that where I feel like I have this community of people. We're all aligned, and we're all just so invested in helping each individual get better. And that's my dream. That's my dream right now. And I don't think it's a far off one. I think it's achievable. It's just a matter of, when is it going to happen? And I have full faith that it will happen at the right time. But, in terms of goals, it's just, how can I help more people, and in what capacity? Because I see clients all day, every day, up to 35 clients a week. And, I need more time, and I can't get more time, right? We all know that. So being able to get people better access to healthcare.
I love it. And as I said, the passion has really shone through throughout the whole conversation. You obviously love this. And I think it stems back from you essentially helping yourself through this journey. And now you're helping others through your training, your expertise, and also your self-exploration. So if people want to learn more about gut health, their diet, what dietitians do, have you got any resources that you recommend? And this opportunity to plug your own, of course. Where should people go to learn more?
Yeah, I mean, there's, if people want to reach out to me too, if they're looking for specific like books on specific topics, of whether it's acid reflux or SIBO or, specific goals of things that they're working on, please message me. I'm happy to send out any resources specific, because there's not like one guidebook that covers it all, unfortunately, unless you're, Human Nutrition Science is a great book, get something like that and you learn about just the basics of physiology. You can really, see things even on social media from a different lens, and it's empowering to really understand the science. But nonetheless, I have a great podcast, Nutrition Rewired, where I try to bring in experts and tie in this holistic health aspect. So, if you're looking for some free information and enjoy this type of long form content, then I would definitely check that out. Otherwise, I'm on Instagram at Nutrition Rewired, and I always try to, again, really provide people with practical free tips that they can take away to optimize their health, whether it's hormone balance, sports nutrition, gut health, really trying to cover all the different areas. But I would love to stay in touch. If anybody has questions or needs resources, I'm always happy to share any of those.
Fabulous. You've been very, very generous with your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. This is great. Really appreciate it.